The small clay lamp burned with a flame so still it might have been painted onto the cold air. A single tongue of amber light set into the shallow ledge of a stone tomb beside the road. The ledge was worn smooth by years of hands and weather, and on it beside the lamp, someone had laid a loose handful of violets, their dark petals already stiffening at the edges with frost. The tomb itself was old brick, faced with a slab of marble, and the marble was a deep grey-white in the darkness, its carved letters catching the lamplight in shallow strokes of shadow. The road ran away from it in both directions, paved with great flat stones that held the day's cold long after the sun had gone. And along the road, further and further into the dark, other small lights burned on other ledges, a scattered chain of flames standing straight up in the motionless winter air. Just beyond the reach of the light, the cold pressed in, laying a fine, white rime over the edge of the stone. The tombs stood shoulder to shoulder along both sides of the road, a street of stone that stretched away into the countryside for mile after mile. Some were tall and faced with polished marble, their carved portraits looking out over the road with calm, worn faces. Some were low and plain, brick and stucco, their roofs rounded like the backs of sleeping animals. Between them, the ground was hard with frost, the winter grass stiff and pale, and here and there a cypress rose black and perfectly still against the enormous scatter of the winter stars. The names were cut deep into the stone, the letters sharp on the newer tombs and worn shallow as breath on the old ones. And everyone was set facing the road, so that anyone passing would read it, would move their lips over it, would carry it a little further into the dark. A name spoken aloud was the whole point of the night. Far back behind the line of graves, the last houses of the city thinned away into gardens and storeyards and low walls. And beyond them, Rome lay quiet and unusually dark, as though the whole city had drawn a breath and were holding it. On the ledges and the steps and the fat tops of the tombs lay the small offerings the families had left through the day. A piece of broken tile wound round with a garland of evergreen, the leaves already brittle with cold. A scattering of grain, the pale kernels bright against the dark stone. 3 or 4 grains of coarse salt catching the light like tiny cold stars. Bread soaked in wine, the purple stain spreading slowly into the crumb. A little milk poured out from a small clay cup, lying pale and thickening in the cold. Loose violets, dark and small, laid straight onto the marble without any tying or arranging, just a handful gathered and set down. And here and there, on the tombs of those who had a little more, a narrow clay pipe was set into the stone, running down through the masonry to where the ashes rested inside. And someone had poured wine slowly into it, a thin, dark stream that disappeared into the mouth of the pipe with a small sound, a quiet, swallowing whisper, like water going into a well. The wine that missed the opening had run down the side of the stone and stood in a dark bead on the frozen ground, and the stain of it would still be there in the morning. The dead asked for very little, and what they wanted was not the price of the gift, but the weight of the hand that left it. The fact that someone had come, that someone had remembered, that someone had spoken the name aloud into the still air. A young man crouched in front of one of the smaller tombs, his woolen cloak pulled up over the back of his head, his breath showing white in the lamplight and drifting slowly away. He reached out and set a lamp straight on its ledge, trimming the wick with a small bronze pin so it would burn even and burn longer. And then he stayed there a moment, with his hand still resting on the cold stone, not praying, not speaking, only resting his palm against the name. A little further down the road, on a stone bench inside a walled garden behind one of the grander tombs, a woman sat wrapped in a heavy cloak with the hood drawn forward. And she had been sitting there a long time while her husband waited a little distance away with the lantern, its flame swaying behind thin panes of scraped horn. She had lost the child years ago, and every year she stayed a little longer than anyone else. And every year her husband waited without speaking. And when at last she rose and came to him, he lifted the lantern a little higher so she could see the road. An old freedman moved slowly along the line of tombs, a man with white hair and careful hands, and he stopped at a monument finer than the others, the tomb of the family that had freed him 40 years before, and brushed the frost from the ledge with his sleeve and set down a small clay cup of wine and stood back with his head bowed. He had no one else to tend and no one else to tend him, and so he came every year and did what the family would have done, and that was enough. A boy of perhaps 10 ran between the monuments with a forgotten cloak bundled in his arms, his hobnails ringing on the frozen paving, running without a trace of fear. Because this was not a place of fear. It was only the road where the grandfathers and the grandmothers and the small lost children lay sleeping in their stone houses, and the lamps were lit for them, and there was nothing in the dark that meant him any harm. The doorway of the tomb chamber was low, built to be stooped through, and inside the air was cool and dry and still, smelling of old stone and lamp oil, and the faint clean dust of ash that had lain undisturbed for years. The walls were cut into row upon row of small rounded niches, arching up toward the curved ceiling like the cells of a great hive, each one holding a clay jar or two, round-bellied and cool to the touch. Below every jar, a small plate of marble bore the name of the one resting there, the letters picked out in red. Tiny lamps burned in some of the niches, flames no bigger than a thumbprint, and the whole chamber held a soft, honey-colored light that moved very slightly as the flames breathed, 100 small shadows shifting on the curved brickwork. Above the rows of niches, 2 letters were cut into the plaster, D and M, and they meant to the mains, to the spirits of the dead, and this small house of jars was given over to them. In these February nights, the family called them by the older and gentler name, and spoke of them simply as the parents. A fresh wreath of dark green bay hung from a nail beside one of the names, the leaves still glossy, giving off a faint, sharp scent. The jars sat quiet in their rows, and the little flames burned on, and the cold outside could not reach in. It was a house built only for resting, and the light inside it was as gentle as a closed eye. Inside the city, the streets were darker than usual and quieter. The heavy bronze doors of the temples were pulled shut, and the great altars in their courtyards stood cold and entirely without fire, and no smoke rose from them, and no priest chanted in the dark of the cellar. No wedding was held anywhere in Rome in these 9 days, and no bride was carried over any threshold with torches and singing. The magistrates went about without their marks of office, their togas plain, their attendants quiet. Even the noise of the workshops seemed to come from further away than usual. And the city had lowered its voice and turned its attention outward, away from the forum and the basilica, toward the roads and the graves and the small lamps burning all along them. It was a time for things not to happen. A space cleared in the rush of the year so that memory could take its place. From deep in the warren of streets came a dog barking, a long way off, and another answered further away. And then the silence came back and settled over the roofs and the dark windows, like a hand laid gently on a sleeping child. On the benches in the tomb gardens, the grandfathers told the old story of where the custom had come from, murmuring it half from memory and half from love, the way old stories are told, while a child leaned against a knee and the coals in the brazier shifted and settled. It began far away and long ago, in a city that was burning. The fire was not close. It was a red glow in the sky behind them, and a thick, soft smoke rolling over the rooftops. And out through that smoke came a man, walking with his old father riding on his shoulders, the old man's thin arms around his son's neck, his cheek against his son's hair. At the man's other hand, a small boy ran to keep up, his fingers tight in his father's grip. And now and then the man glanced down and saw the top of that head, the dark hair tousled, and tightened his hold. They did not look back. The old man was light as a bundle of sticks, and he rested his head against his son's shoulder and trusted him completely. The three of them came out of the city together, the old man and the strong man and the child. And behind them the red glow faded and the smoke thinned, and the road went on. The sea took them after that, a long wandering from shore to shore, from harbour to harbour, and the old father grew older and slower and quieter. He sat in the stern with a blanket over his knees and watched the foreign coastlines slide past. And his grandson sat beside him, and the water went by, blue and then grey and then blue again. At last, in a friendly harbour on a warm coast where the hills stood green behind the shore, the old man lay down and died, softly of age, the way a lamp goes out when the oil is spent. They laid him under a mound of earth near the sea, with green turf over him and the sound of the waves close by. His son stood at the mound a long time with the boy beside him. And then the ship sailed on, and the mound stayed behind, with the grass growing over it, and the year turned. A year went by, turning slowly through its seasons of wind and rain, and the ships came back to that same coast, sailing into the same harbour with the familiar hills rising green behind it. The man stood at the rail and watched the land come nearer, and he knew what day it was. He had been counting all through the turning of the year, and now the day had come round again, the day his father had died. And here he was, by chance or by something else, standing off the same shore on the same morning. And he could not let it pass unmarked in the strange country with no one to say the name. It was not a question of grief, or at least not only of grief. It was the steady, tender determination to keep a day, to say to the earth and the sky and the listening gods that this was his father, that his father was remembered, and that the thread between them had not been broken by the year or the sea or the weight of the soil on the mound. The whole company went up from the ships to the mound in the morning warmth, walking slowly through the long grass. And the man stood at his father's grave, with the green hills behind him and the blue sea below, and the sun warm on his shoulders. They bound green leaves about their heads, as the custom was, every man of them crowned with cut branches. He took up 2 tall cups of rich, unmixed wine and poured them slowly out onto the ground, and the wine sank into the earth and was gone. He poured 2 cups of fresh milk, and it spread in a pale pool and sank away as well. He scattered dark flowers from an armful, the small, simple flowers of that coast, and they lay on the turf of the mound like shadows. And then he spoke to his father aloud, by name, in the morning stillness, and called him greeting, as though his father were only in the next room, only a little way off, only waiting to answer. The spoken name hung in the warm air over the mound, tying a knot between the living man standing in the sun and the silent one resting in the dark. And then it settled into the earth like the wine and the milk, and the morning was very still. And then, out of the foot of the tomb, out of the very base of the mound where the earth was soft and dark, something moved. A great serpent came sliding slowly into the light, enormous and unhurried and gleaming, its coils going round and round the mound in smooth, wide curves. Its back was marked with deep blue, the color of the sea at evening, and its scales were lit with flecks of gold that caught the sunlight and glinted like a rainbow lying on a cloud when the sun strikes it. It moved without any menace at all, its great head low and swaying gently, and it wound among the cups and the scattered dishes, touching lightly at the wine and the milk and the fallen flowers. Nobody screamed, nobody ran. The man stood quite still with his hands at his sides, watching, and the great serpent tasted the offerings and then turned, slow as a river turning, and slid quietly back down into the mound, coil by coil, and was gone. The grass settled. The cups stood where they had been. Nothing was bitten, nothing was broken, and the morning was as warm and still as before. He did not know whether he had seen the spirit of the place or some kindly servant of his father. And in the end he decided only this, and decided it gladly, that the offering had been accepted. So the offering was completed with gladness rather than dread, and the company spread cloths on the grass and shared the food they had brought. And for that one bright day, the grave was not a place of sorrow, but a place where a family was together and even happy, where a child laughed and a cup was passed and the sun was warm on the stone. And when the days had turned round again, on the 9th morning from that one, they held games on that shore in the old man's honour, the ships racing out across the bay and back, runners on the flat ground above the beach, boxers with their hands bound, archers shooting at a mark, and the boys riding in their winding patterns while everyone watched. 9 days from the offering to the games, and 9 days too the Romans kept for their own dead out on their own cold road. 9 days after a death as well, before the house was its own again. And the grandfathers on the benches liked to say that the one had taught the other. This much at least they were sure of, that the Day of the Dead is kept not with terror but with flowers, a little wine, the speaking of a name, and a meal. And there was one more thing the grandfathers told about that same son and that same father, touching it softly near the end, before the story was folded up and put away. Not long after, still in the same years of wandering, while he was still a living man, he went down into the country of the dead. A priestess led him in through a cave near the sea, and he walked among quiet fields under a green light that never changed, and there he found his father. He went toward him with his arms held out, and he tried 3 times to put his arms around the old man's neck, and 3 times the shade slipped through his hands like a light wind, like a dream flying away at the moment of waking. 3 times he closed his arms on something warm and utterly beloved, and 3 times it dissolved into the still green air and left him holding nothing. Not because his father was gone, but because the dead are made of something that arms cannot hold, and only memory can touch. And perhaps that was why the living left food on a stone and spoke the names aloud into the cold. Because a name spoken once a year in the winter dark is a thread that goes all the way down into the quiet fields and lets the dead know they are still loved. The warm shore of the old story went quiet, its voices fading into the sound of waves on a foreign sand, and the calm of it flowed slowly back up into the cold Roman night. The stars had wheeled a little further while the story was told, and the frost had thickened on every ledge and every carved name. And the lamps were burning lower now, their flames smaller and steadier and more yellow. One of the last families still out on the road was walking back toward the gate, with their lanterns swaying between them, the father carrying the basket that had held the bread and the wine and the violets, the children quiet and heavy with sleep. Their breath made small clouds that bloomed and faded as they walked. The old gateway stood open on the road as it always did, a high arch of worn stone with nobody set to guard it. And the lantern light slid over the cold frost-furred vault as they passed beneath. A little inside, 2 of the night watch stood at a brazier of charcoal glowing red at their feet, keeping an eye on the street rather than the arch. And one of them lifted a hand as the family went by. The streets were narrow and dark and quiet, but here and there a light showed under a door, and the smell of wood smoke hung in the cold air. Then they were at their own door, and the door opened, and warmth came out to meet them. The brazier in the corner still glowing, the shutters closed tight against the night. The children were put to bed still half asleep, their cold feet tucked under woolen blankets. An old dog resettled on the warm floor beside the coals with a sigh, and a small lamp was left burning by the household shrine, where the little painted gods stood in their niche, and the father touched the shrine lightly with his fingertips as he passed, a gesture so old and so habitual that he did not even know he had made it. And when the 9 days were over, when the last lamp had burned down on the last tomb and the last family had come home, there came the day the Romans called the Caristia, the day of the dear Kindred. The living sat down at one table, the relatives gathered together, and the ill feeling of the year was set down at the door like a stone taken out of a shoe. The little household gods were given their portion of the food, a few small bites set aside on a plate, and a pinch of incense was dropped onto the coals so that a thin, fragrant smoke rose and curled against the ceiling. And somewhere at that table, an uncle who had not spoken to his brother since the summer reached across and passed him the bread, and the brother took it, and their fingers touched, and nothing was said, and nothing needed to be said, and something that had been hard all through the winter softened and was gone. The meal went on, and the wine was poured, and the voices rose and fell, and the names that had been spoken out on the road were spoken again here, in the lamplight, over the food. The living gathered in a warmth that the cold night among the stones had earned. Out on the road, the tombs stood quiet along both sides of the dark, the carved faces looking out at the empty paving. The violets on the ledges had gone stiff with frost, their petals dark and brittle, holding a little of their sweetness even so. The lamps burned down, one after another, along the long line of monuments, the small flames leaning and straightening in a breath of cold air, leaning and straightening, and then going out softly, one by one, like eyes closing, like breaths released. A thin curl of smoke rising from each wick, and then vanishing. A cat crossed between two tombs and was gone. The cypresses stood black against the stars, moving so slightly that the movement was more felt than seen. The winter sky wheeled slowly overhead, the great cold patterns turning through their ancient rounds, and below them the road lay dark and quiet, the stone street of the dead, the names still there, still waiting for the morning when the sun would touch them, and the living would walk past and read them and speak them aloud. And the night held them all, the living and the dead, the warm houses and the cold stone, and the darkness was calm and deep, and full of a kindness that had no need of words.